I used to think that in a family, everything would be as clear as the pictures hanging in the living room. Father, mother, children, each with their own place, their own indispensable role. But as I grew older, I realized that sometimes the silence that stretched out around the dinner table held more weight than any words. In Madison, each winter seemed colder than the last, with snow piling up on the porch, but the cold I remembered most always came from inside the house, from my father's gaze and his brief words. The Sheffield family home sat at the end of an oak-lined street, its roof ashen, and the smoke from its kitchen drifted gently into the evening air. Every evening, my mother, Carol, bustled about in the kitchen, sometimes humming old tunes. I was always her kitchen hand, helping to pick vegetables while listening to the distant whistling from the living room, where my father, Franklin, and two older brothers, Calvin and Greg, sat in front of the television, talking animatedly about a local football game. Each had a place, a script. Even though I was only 10, I was already accustomed to circling quietly around the edges of their world. Dinner was always a special ritual in our house. Carol would set out plates of roast chicken, creamy mashed potatoes, and always a slice of pumpkin pie for dessert. I loved the attention to detail, from the carefully folded napkins to the neatly arranged salt and pepper. We all gathered around the old wooden table, each taking our usual seats, Calvin next to Dad, Greg next to him, and I usually sat at the end of the table, facing Mom. It was a night like any other in Wisconsin winter. Outside the window, the streetlights cast a pale yellow glow over the snow. My father sat up straight, his chin lifted, his voice loud and clear as he asked Calvin about today's math test. Calvin excitedly told me about the A+ he'd just gotten, Franklin nodding in approval, his eyes shining with undisguised pride. Greg chimed in with a story about his game-winning throw at football practice, and we both laughed again, Franklin's hand patting my brother's shoulder. Carol, ever tactful, tried to draw me into the conversation. Lauren finished her science project today, Mom said softly, looking at me encouragingly. I smiled, a tiny bit of hope rising in me. But Dad just glanced over, nodded, and said, "That's good." No further questions, no lingering glances. I felt my hands go cold under the table, and my self-consciousness rippled like an undercurrent. With that short sentence, all my efforts were suddenly in vain, as if my achievement was just a small part lost in the midst of my brother's brilliant achievements. After dinner, while the men returned to the football game on TV, my mother and I cleaned up the kitchen. Carol took my hand and squeezed it gently, as if to comfort me. No words were needed, just a gentle warmth and a loving gaze. "You did a good job," she whispered, but I wasn't sure I believed it. I often wondered why I felt so out of place in my own family, and with each passing day, the answer seemed further and further away. As darkness settled over Madison, I lay in bed, listening to the wind whistling outside my window. Frost formed tiny patterns on the glass, and the dim light of street lamps cast strange shapes. I imagined myself a famous scientist, admired by the world, but in my dreams, my father stood far away, nodding indifferently. Sometimes I wrote in pencil in my diary, hidden in my desk drawer, words that only I could read, about my dreams, about my unanswered questions. As I grew older, I realized that in the Sheffield household, love was not compliments or hugs. It was strictness, standards, and unspoken expectations. Calvin and Greg seemed to be born to meet those expectations, and I, no matter how hard I tried, was just a shadow on the edge of family life. At the end of a long day, I touched the thin layer of frost on the glass door, leaving behind a tiny fingerprint. I wondered if my father would ever truly see me, or would I forever be an outsider, silently observing the happiness of others? Even though I had no answer, I still dreamed, still hoped, even if it was just a small ray of light in the long winter of my childhood. They say childhood is the foundation of who you are. But no one tells you that there are shadows so long that you will always walk under them, no matter how hard you try to hold your head up. When I think back to my early years in Madison, I remember that feeling so clearly full of hope, but also suffocated by the fear of being forgotten. I learned to keep my dreams to myself from an early age, as if the very idea of dreaming was somehow incompatible with the staid atmosphere of the Sheffield household. Every night, I lay in my cot, staring up at a ceiling covered with posters of planets, great works, and scientists I admired. To me, these patches of color were a world unto themselves, a place where I didn't have to worry about being left out, where I didn't have to compete with my brother's shadow. My school days passed quietly and rhythmically. I was not the most outstanding kid in class, but I always finished my homework and secretly hoped that the teacher would notice. During recess, I often sat quietly in the corner of the cafeteria, biting into chicken nuggets, drinking chocolate milk, watching my classmates laughing and talking about topics unfamiliar to me. Once, I glued my eyes to the small notebook in my hand, trying to quickly jot down an idea for a science project that I thought would make me different. But at that age, being different often meant being lonely. The spring of my 13th year, my school held a science fair. I spent weeks designing a model house powered by solar cells, cutting, gluing, wiring, tinkering with foil and tiny LEDs. Carol watched me work with gentle patience, occasionally asking questions, but Franklin seemed unconcerned. He was always busy with work or Greg's baseball games. "Just stay out of trouble," my father would say when I bragged about my project. Perhaps his daughter's dream was just teenage bravado. The day of the fair, the gymnasium was filled with colorful models and charts. I stood next to my creation, a mixture of anticipation and dread. Friends and parents streamed in, laughter and chatter filling the air. I glanced around, hoping to see Franklin in the doorway, but there was only Carol. Mom appeared with a bag of vanilla ice cream, smiling encouragingly. "Your dad couldn't make it because Greg had a baseball game, but I'm so proud of you." I swallowed my disappointment and forced a smile. Maybe I was used to it. When the organizers announced my name as the winner, I stood on the stage and looked down to see my mother clapping enthusiastically. When I returned home, I held the small medal in my arms, but didn't know who to share it with. Franklin welcomed me home with a nod and the familiar question, "Did you stay out of trouble?" I nodded, trying not to show my sadness. At dinner that night, the topic turned to Greg's baseball achievements, the winning hit that filled the whole family with excitement. I tried to finish my cold French fries, quietly watching the yellow light spread across the dining table. One memorable moment was when a classmate's father, Mr. Patterson, came up to congratulate me right in front of Franklin. "Your daughter did a great job. That model is great." Franklin just smiled and nodded, then immediately moved on to talking about Greg's soccer game with excitement in his eyes. Sometimes I wonder if I am invisible in my own house. That night, Carol brought me ice cream. Mom didn't say much, just sat next to me and ate with me in silence. There are things that don't need words, but the silence between mother and daughter is the greatest source of encouragement I have. When Mom went back to my room, I opened my diary and let my tears soak into the paper. Someday, I will build something that even Dad can't ignore. I promised myself in small words. The years of high school continued to pass quietly. I worked harder than ever, throwing myself into projects, tests, and science clubs as if that was the only way to assert myself. Occasionally, I felt inferior when I saw my brother being bragged by Franklin in front of his friends. However, that no longer made me feel sorry for myself like before, but became a hidden motivation that pushed me to persevere. Looking back, I know that it was the feeling of being ignored and not being seen that made me who I am today. I learned not to depend on the recognition of others to survive, and also learned to light up my own little world with curiosity and determination. The school cafeteria with the smell of chicken nuggets, sweet chocolate milk, the lonely lunches, all became unforgettable memories, raising a resilient Lauren who still yearned for a look from her father. I often wonder, if Franklin had stopped, listened, and looked at me properly, would things have been different? But that night, I carved a promise into my heart. One day, I would build something so great, my father would never be able to look away. Leaving home, I realized that there are distances that cannot be measured in miles or trains that connect Madison to the rest of the world. The real boundary is sometimes between a look and indifference, between a question and silence. There were times when I dragged my suitcase onto the bus, wondering if anyone would notice that I was gone, or if I would remain a pale shadow in my family's minds. I arrived at the University of Wisconsin feeling both excited and unfamiliar. The vast autumn campus, filled with the yellow of maple trees and the sweet chill of early winter, was like a new promised land. On the first day I moved into the dormitory, I touched the name tag on my door, Lauren Sheffield. No one reminded me to get up early. No one waited for me at the dining table. No one asked if I had done my homework. All the responsibilities, all the joys, all the sorrows were now mine to bear. My dorm room was cramped but cozy, shared with 3 roommates, including Janine, a girl from Green Bay with a bright smile and a shrill voice. We quickly bonded over late night studying, cold pizza, and skipping classes to the little coffee shop down the street. Janine had a knack for turning failures into jokes, and I gradually learned to open up, to share things I had long kept hidden. Amidst the hustle and bustle, I found deep solace in physics and math classes, late-night practice sessions, where I was no longer someone else's shadow, but myself, adapting, striving, and growing every day. Independent living wasn't always easy. After school, I worked part-time at the school library and occasionally took weekend shifts at a bakery near my dorm. I taught myself to budget, to save every penny for breakfast or a new coat. On the coldest nights, when snow was falling outside my window, I would lie under the covers, listening to the sports news from the next room, and suddenly miss my small kitchen at home and the strange silence at the dining table. Every holiday, I would come home, pack my bags, and step into a familiar yet strange space. Franklin would still ask about my grades and then move on to discuss Calvin and Greg's latest achievements. I gradually learned to accept these brief conversations as a part of my life, not expecting much. Instead, Carol would send me small packages regularly, homemade cookies, knitting, sometimes just a card with a few words of encouragement, but enough for me to feel her tenderness, even if only in her handwriting. My sophomore year, I won a prestigious science scholarship. It was an achievement I had never dreamed of. When my name was announced at the awards ceremony, I had reserved a seat for my family in the front row. I glanced expectantly, but it was empty. Other students happily hugged their parents and friends. I accepted the award, bowing my head in gratitude to the applause of strangers, while my phone flashed a short text message from Franklin. "Well done. Keep it up." No exclamation point, no warm compliment. I put the phone in my pocket, telling myself that I wouldn't let his absence dim the joy I deserved. Janine and I became best friends, experiencing the full range of Midwestern college life, from pizza nights that lasted until dawn, to cold outdoor football games, to hangouts at the quaint downtown bar. I learned to enjoy the little things, a cup of hot cocoa, a warm scarf, or simply the feeling of being in control of my own life. Gradually, I realized that freedom wasn't a gift, but the result of picking myself up after failure, of learning to forgive myself when I lost my way. When I returned home, I was still in a state of limbo, half hopeful, half cautious. Franklin still lavished praise on his brothers. Stories about me were passed over as a matter of course, nothing worth discussing. But I stopped feeling sad. Instead, I began writing long letters to my mother, telling her about my new life, my plans, and the vague longings I could not express to anyone else. The night I received my award, I walked quietly back to my dorm through the deep snow. Madison was strangely quiet, the yellow lights of the streets twinkling. I realized that maybe it was time to stop waiting for the applause and nods of approval that I knew would never come. Instead, I patted myself on the back with the quiet pride of having walked through the darkness to find my own light. You can spend your whole life chasing medals, achievements, and glittering accolades, but when you come home, all that's left is silence. I understand that feeling better than anyone else as I enter my early 20s, when doors start to open, but loneliness grows with each step I climb. I remember the first morning I saw my name printed on the glass door of an aerospace lab in Madison. Lauren Sheffield, systems engineer, gleamed in the slanting sunlight. It was a moment I had dreamed of. I imagined picking up the phone, calling my family to share my joy, to hear a warm greeting. But then I hesitated, the phone lying silent on the table, my pride stifled by a familiar fear, my father's polite indifference. The new work environment was challenging. The lab was large, the machines and screens flashed, and the colleagues were mostly men, speaking firmly, busy with projects related to satellites and spacecraft. At first, I felt like a lost child in an adult world. But Miguel, my direct supervisor, soon recognized my passion and the meticulousness in my calculations. "You have the mind of a real scientist, Lauren," Miguel said, his eyes sincere, without a trace of cliché. His trust encouraged me to be bolder, to take on important tasks, to propose ideas that I had previously kept to myself. Outside of work, I live in a small apartment overlooking a lakeside park, with drawings, models, and sticky notes all over the walls. On weekends, Janine and I wander through craft beer bars, sampling everything from mild to strong, listening to the anecdotes of strangers. Janine is the first person to jump up and hug me when I get a promotion, the one who takes me for a walk in the park at night, or sits silently beside me while I read my mother's old letters. Carol still writes to me regularly, short letters filled with gentle encouragement. Whenever I miss home, I read each letter to calm my heart, to remind myself that there is still a small corner of love in this world. I thought I had reached some proud milestones, being assigned to lead a new project team, presenting to top engineers, signing my first contract. But Franklin's biggest moments were only in quick phone calls. The night I received my first major recognition, I called home. My father answered the phone in a calm, somewhat distant voice. I shared the good news, hoping to hear something different, a little excitement, a rare compliment. All he asked was, "Did you meet anyone special there?" I was momentarily taken aback and tried to smile and cover it up. Embarrassment filled the conversation, which ended quickly with a cold hang-up. At work, Miguel encouraged me to share my ideas and encouraged me to speak at big meetings. One day, he sent me a personal email. "Lauren, I want you to represent our team at this year's National Science Congress." My heart was pounding. I knew this was an opportunity that not everyone gets, especially at my age. Janine popped champagne to celebrate with me and took me to the lake park, cheering under the stars. "You're amazing, Lauren. Don't let anyone make you feel like you're not worth all the effort you put in," she said. I tried calling home to tell him the news, hoping that this time Franklin would be different. But his response was still a brief, almost unconscious compliment. "Yeah, that's great." I heard the television on the other end of the line, and he quickly moved on to asking about Greg, as if I were just a small news item amid the big Sheffield events. That night, I sat alone by the window of my small apartment, pouring myself a glass of red wine. Outside, the city lights reflected off the ripples of the lake. I reread my mother's letter, thinking about the lavish compliments I had hoped for but never received. I said to myself, maybe proud is a word I will have to learn to say for myself, because sometimes no one else will. I raised my glass, looking out at the city at night, feeling a strange feeling, lonely and strong at the same time. I knew that, even without the applause or hug from my father, I had come further than ever before, and perhaps I was mature enough to recognize myself. The world is strange. It applauds your perseverance, pats you on the back when you reach a new milestone. But no one warns you of the price of persistence, of not daring to stop even for a moment, for fear that when you stop, you will become forgotten again. Janine used to joke, "You don't need a blanket, your ambition is warm enough." But little did she know, there were nights when I curled up by the window, watching the snow fall on Madison Street and realizing that, despite the abundance of things outside, the trophies, the certificates, the walls covered with certificates, I was still cold to the bone. Working at a high-security research center is not for everyone. Every day, I pass through steel doors, show my identification card, and enter a world where every move is recorded by cameras and every conversation is limited by confidentiality rules. Here, people move fast, the coffee is strong, and the hum of machines and testing equipment does not stop day or night. My team's satellite project has just been successfully launched into orbit. I am announced in a small company ceremony. Miguel shakes my hand, my colleagues congratulate me, and cameras flash. As the applause rang out, and I stealthily opened my phone, scrolling through my notifications. No text from Franklin. No greetings, no congratulatory calls. Only Carol, as always, leaving a sweet voicemail, her voice warm, "I'm so proud of you, Lauren. Even though your dad's busy, I know he's happy." Sometimes I think she's comforting herself more than me. At the end of the day, when everyone else is heading out to the local craft beer bar, I'm home, curled up on the old couch in my one-bedroom apartment. The walls are covered in blueprints, the desk is covered in scraps of paper, the top cupboard is covered in certificates, each one a testament to my hard work, a testament to my dedication. Miguel stopped by my desk at the end of the meeting. "You should take a break, Lauren. Success takes time to enjoy." I smiled awkwardly and thanked him, but I knew, deep down, that I was still worried that if I stopped, if I didn't do anything remarkable, I would disappear from the memories of those I loved. On the weekend, Janine invited me to the farmer's market. Amid the buzz of vendors and the aroma of red apples, roasting corn, and fresh-baked waffles. It was a typical Sunday morning. We stopped at a familiar local diner, ordered pancakes and black coffee. Watching Janine tell jokes to the owner, I suddenly realized how much small joy I'd missed out on while chasing invisible validation. I ate breakfast, my mind still wandering to work emails, unfinished tasks, and the phone call I was waiting for but knew wouldn't come. In the evening, as the noise faded, I returned to my small apartment alone. The electronics were still on, computers running reports, satellite models spinning slowly on shelves, pale yellow reading lamps casting shadows on the walls. I received an email from the Regional Leadership Awards Committee. "We are pleased to nominate you for the Best Young Leader of the Midwest." It was the kind of award Franklin would have wanted for Calvin or Greg, a testament to undeniable excellence. I wanted to call my father, to share my joy, but when I picked up the phone, my courage faltered at the sight of the silent screen. Franklin only sent a short message when I told him, "Congratulations. Call me when you get a chance." Reading that message, I felt emptier than ever. Sometimes I wondered, should I keep trying, keep collecting titles and awards just to hope that one day he would look at me the same way he used to look at you guys? maybe I was wrong. Maybe I would have to learn to be proud of myself without needing anyone's validation. Late at night, I stood in my kitchenette, pouring myself a glass of cold water. The street lights reflected off the glass windows, creating streaks of light on the walls. The sound of the car engine mixed with the sound of the computer still running, blending with the quiet beating of my heart, steadfast, relentless. I wondered, am I building a solid future or just running away from a past that has never been healed? Either way, I knew I couldn't stop, couldn't let go, until I truly believed that I was good enough, even if that only meant something to myself. Sometimes the most important invitations come with more strings attached than you might expect. The older I get, the more I realize that in my family, nothing is truly unconditional, not love, not pride, not invitations to big parties. Spring in Madison arrived with soft sunshine and wildflowers dotting the roadsides. I sat at my desk, my fingers tapping away at the keyboard, my mind still preoccupied with work. That was when the phone rang, the screen saying, "Dad." I hesitated for a second before picking up. "Lauren," Franklin said, his voice strangely formal, as if he were reciting a prepared line in his head. "I'm calling to invite you to my retirement party later this month. There will be a lot of people, old colleagues, relatives. I hope you'll be there." The way he emphasized each word made me think of the years I spent as a shadow on the fringes of family events, present, but never the center of attention. The awkward conversation continued for a few more minutes, mostly Franklin rattling off details about the party, location, time, guest list. Every sentence he said was formal and formulaic, without a single friendly pause or small question about how my life was going. On the other end of the line, Calvin and Greg were on a group call, talking about new suits, rehearsed speeches, expectations for a perfect night. They mentioned me as part of the guest list, nothing more, nothing less. When the call ended, I sat motionless for a long time, staring at the afternoon-drenched window. Having spent my childhood outside the circle of light that surrounded my family, I was now invited in, but I couldn't help but wonder if I was the main character or just a decoration in Franklin's perfect picture. Was this invitation too late, or was it me who missed the mark? I called Janine and told her everything, still hesitant. She laughed. "If you go, go for yourself, not for him. Think of it as a treat for yourself, a chance to end the past the way you want." The words echoed in my head as I trudged into the bustling weekend department store, browsing the rows of dresses shimmering under the neon lights. I picked up each dress, then put it down. Each one seemed right, but none of them made me feel like myself. I finally settled on a simple, soft, pale blue dress, almost the color of the sky the day I left home for college. In my hands, my gift for Franklin was equally simple, a meticulously carved wooden frame containing an old family photo, everyone smiling naturally, uninhibited. When I got home that night, I went through my drawers and reread my mother's old messages, the gentle, encouraging words, "You deserve to be happy, wherever you are, whoever you are with." I thought about Carol, about her patience, about the times she was the only one who noticed when I was sad, even if it was just a look or a quiet squeeze of my hand. In the family chat, Calvin and Greg were still talking excitedly about the ceremony. Carol sent me a private message. "The whole family will be happy if you come back, not because of anyone else, but because family always needs each other." After reading it, I suddenly realized that sometimes people do not go to parties because of the host, but because they want to find the part of themselves that they have forgotten in their adult years. Finally, I texted the group, "I'm coming back." My heart was pounding, excited and scared. I didn't know if my presence would make a difference, or just serve as a backdrop for Franklin's pride. But this time, I was going for myself, no longer a child seeking approval, but an adult seeking closure for the days of missing a beat. That night, I stood in front of my closet, holding an old family photo, a picture of me, Calvin, Greg, Carol, and Franklin laughing together at the lakeside park years ago. I wondered what I really wanted from this goodbye, my father's approval, or my own forgiveness for all the years of waiting for something that never came. Looking at myself in the mirror, I realized there were moments when no one could give me the answers but myself. And whatever those answers were, I was ready to step into the light this time, as myself. You can rehearse a speech 100 times, fine-tune every word, imagine every eye on you on stage, but nothing can prepare you for a party designed to drown your own worth. That's how I felt as I walked into Franklin's retirement party, a heavy, foreboding sense that things weren't going to be as easy as polite invitations pretended. I arrived at the hotel early, my simple pale blue dress standing out among the elegantly dressed guests. The large ballroom was ablaze with chandeliers, long tables covered in white tablecloths, dishes glistening under the yellow light. Busy waiters moved about, bringing plates of hot bread, Wisconsin roast beef, beet salad, mashed potatoes, and regional specialties to the tables. I walked slowly around the room, wanting to observe every corner, trying to find a familiar face that would reassure me in the sea of strangers. Franklin was already there, standing in the middle of the large room, surrounded by former colleagues, longtime neighbors, childhood friends, and, of course, Calvin and Greg, always striking in their confident smiles and impeccably tailored suits. I heard congratulations, old stories, and most of all, a constant emphasis on my brother's accomplishments. They talked about baseball awards, military exploits, the Sheffield boys, the pride that followed Franklin. My name, if mentioned at all, was passed over as a side note in the long story of the perfect family. Carol stood quietly in the back of the room, her eyes warm but worried. She chatted with a few relatives, glancing back at me as if to make sure I was okay. Suddenly, Shirley, my mother's childhood friend, a silver-haired woman with kind eyes, came to me. She gently took my hand and whispered, "Just be yourself, Lauren." Sometimes, just one person standing strong can change the whole room. The words felt like a small anchor in the sea of emotions that were pulling me away. Before the ceremony began, I found a quiet corner, took out a small folded piece of paper from my bag, the speech I had been revising over and over all week, and read it over silently, trying to calm myself. In the small gift box I brought was an old photo frame, a family photo I had personally selected, and a card with the words, "Thank you, Dad, for being a part of my childhood, even if only for a few times." The words were short, but filled with things that had never been said. The music faded, and groups of guests began to disperse to their tables. As I walked past the counter, the smell of fresh bread, hot butter, and roasted meats wafted through the air, mixed with the murmur of gossip, the clinking of glasses, and the laughter of the older men and women sitting in the corner. I tried to keep a smile on my face, reminding myself that I was here not only for Franklin, but for myself. For one last time, I wanted to test what else I could expect. As I circled around the outside of the ballroom, about to head back to my table, I overheard Franklin talking to an old colleague, his voice low and firm. "Lauren? She's creative, but frankly, she's not practical. Always chasing after the big ideas. You know, not everyone fits in this world." Hearing that, I felt like someone had poured cold water on me. The pain was no longer a hidden, secretive thing. It was overt, cold, as if all the lights in the room had suddenly gone out and I was alone. I stood silently against the wood paneling, breathing slowly to stop the tears from welling up. Since I was a child, I had dreamed of surprising Franklin. I had imagined 1,000 times the moment my name would be called on stage, at a big event, with my father standing proudly in the audience applauding. But I had never imagined that tonight, I would be the one to open my own heartbreak right on the stage my father had built. I asked myself, if even now I am not enough, then what is enough? As I walked towards the table, all the sounds seemed to recede, leaving only my own heartbeat pounding in my chest. Looking around, I caught Carol's eyes. She nodded slightly, as if to remind me that, no matter what the outcome, I had someone on my side. I realized tonight would change everything for better or worse. And no matter what, I would no longer walk in someone else's shadow, but would hold my head up and walk toward my own light. When the room is silent, you realize how powerful your own voice is. I used to think of courage as something loud, a dramatic act, a shout out to the crowd. But tonight, in the brightly lit ballroom, I understood. Courage can also be resolute silence, holding your head up when all you want to do is run. The grand ballroom was filled with guests, each table lit with candles, the flickering light reflecting off the crystal glasses, silver plates, and delicately arranged bouquets of fresh flowers. There was a murmur of conversation, the clink of glasses, and the soft clatter of high heels on the polished floor. I sat at a table to the right of the stage, my heart pounding nervously as I saw Franklin take the podium. He began with a long thank you, listing the names of each colleague, each partner, and not forgetting to lavish praise on Calvin and Greg, the outstanding sons, continuing the Sheffield family tradition. Each of Franklin's sentences was like an arrow shot into the air, making everyone nod in agreement, laughter ringing out every time he recounted an old memory of the two brothers. I looked at Calvin and Greg, both of them smiling proudly, their shoulders linked like the two brightest stars in the family sky. Then Franklin turned to me, his smile thin. And Lauren, she's always been into new things, into trying things I never understood. He paused, scanning the room as if to gauge a reaction, then continued in a half-joking tone, Gia. Every family needs someone to break tradition, right everyone? The crowd laughed politely. A few people exchanged sympathetic glances. In that moment, I felt like I was being exposed in a sea of people. The old pain suddenly came rushing back, the years when I was just a quiet shadow on the edge of my brother's spotlight. I took a deep breath, the words my mother had written in her letter whispering in my ear. You don't need anyone's approval, you just need to believe in yourself. I stood up. The pale blue dress gently touched the floor. Each step seemed to prolong the decade of silence that had passed. I crossed the room, holding the small box, a gift I had prepared long ago, and headed toward the stage, where all eyes were on me. Franklin looked at me, his expression one of surprise, then confusion, when I didn't have a microphone, no speech prepared. I just looked straight at him, softly but clearly, to the father who believed in me. I placed the box on the podium. Inside was an old photo of us at the science fair when I was a kid, when he used to smile genuinely at me, and a small note, I used to dream of making you proud, but now I'm proud of myself. No hate, no anger, just the truth of my heart. The room fell silent. A few people whispered, chairs screeched, and Carol covered her mouth to stifle a sob. Shirley, her eyes shining with encouragement, was the first to clap, a quiet but resounding applause. Janine, who was at my table, stood silently, too, her eyes shining with pride. Franklin was stunned, holding the gift, speechless. The remaining guests, some curious, some apologetic, a few nodding respectfully, began to murmur. No one laughed. No one said a word to me, but I knew they had witnessed something more than a speech. I left the ballroom to a murmur of amazement, the lights still blazing behind me. Outside, the chill of an early summer night swept through the hotel hallway, making me shiver, but also, for the first time, feeling truly relieved. I took a deep breath, no longer someone's daughter, no longer a shadow that needed to be illuminated by others, but a free Lauren, stepping out of the past and into her own life. In the dim light of the parking lot, I looked back at the ballroom, where Carol was still leaning against the door, her eyes teary but bright with pride. I suddenly remembered the bittersweet taste of pumpkin pie on the table. Like this life, there are things that must be lost to fully appreciate the sweetness of freedom and dignity. It was strange. Freedom was something I had longed for all these years, yet when I actually touched it, that first night felt indescribably heavy, as if invisible chains had been removed, but my whole body still bore the marks. The air outside the hotel was colder than I expected. As I stepped out of the main door, the pale yellow light of the empty street reflected on the mottled pavement, and the noises behind me seemed to be closed in with the glass door. I walked slowly toward the car, each step clearly hearing the sound of my shoes scraping against the cement floor. My breath evaporated in the cold air, my hands trembling as I opened the car door, sat in the driver's seat, and leaned my head on the steering wheel. A feeling of emptiness filled my mind, nothing. Not the triumph I had imagined, but the strange silence as a chapter of life closed. The phone vibrated in my jacket pocket. I let it sit for a few minutes, not wanting to hear anyone, not wanting to explain or answer questions I hadn't answered myself. But then, out of habit or a desire for connection, I pulled it out. The first message was from Carol, simply, "Are you okay?" Below it was from Janine, "Proud of you. Coffee tomorrow morning." The words were small and warm, like a hug from afar. Notifications from my family group chat popped up on my screen. I hesitated, then decided not to open it, not ready to face the reactions of Calvin, Greg, and Franklin. Unanswered questions filled my head. What did they think of me? Would they be embarrassed, angry, or relieved that I had finally made a mess once and quietly backed out? I drove home through empty streets, the traffic lights changing silently at the empty intersection. Madison was unusually quiet tonight, or maybe it was just my mind, oblivious to all the noise outside. When I got to my apartment, I dropped my bag on the table, took off my coat, and sank down on the sofa. The heater was on, humming softly, the warmth spreading slowly, but it did nothing to dispel the loneliness that was creeping up inside me. I looked around the familiar apartment, the shelves filled with papers and books, the old photo I'd framed to bring to the party now sitting quietly on the table, the coffee mug stacked side by side as a testament to all the late nights. I thought about every moment of tonight, from Franklin's stunned look, to Shirley and Janine's small claps, to Carol's shaky smile. I'd waited for this day, thinking that standing up for myself would be a sweet freedom. But it turned out that freedom also meant losing the last peg that held me in the old rut. I leaned back in my chair, tears not falling, just feeling like someone had just taken a part of me without even saying goodbye. The dizziness gradually passed. I poured myself a glass of water, placed it by the fireplace, and picked up the phone again. A new message from Aunt Shirley. "I wish I had your courage years ago. You are not alone." I read it over and over again, comforted, but also filled with sadness. Perhaps every woman in my family had had a night like this, sitting quietly in the midst of her newfound freedom, wondering what she had lost or gained. The sky was getting light. The first rays of sunlight crept through the window, illuminating the wooden floor and the chair where I sat. I made a cup of black coffee, the aroma spreading, bitter on the tip of my tongue, but making me feel at peace. Outside, the city of Madison began to wake up, the sound of cars passing by, people calling to each other, all reminding me that a new day had begun, even though I wasn't ready. I looked out the window, seeing the trees cast their shadows on the damp road. I wondered, is letting go really a loss, or is it the only way to grow? Tonight, I am no longer someone's daughter, no longer a child looking for approval. I am just Lauren, with all the pain, all the hope, and all the heavy freedom I have chosen for myself. Honesty has a price, and sometimes the people who demand it the most are the ones who are least willing to pay it. I woke up that morning with a familiar heaviness, as if, despite my choice of freedom, the world around me was waiting to see where I would go, where I would end up with it. The small kitchen in my apartment was messier than usual. Unwashed coffee cups were stacked, sticky notes were scattered across the table, and the laptop screen was still lit, displaying the headline of a story about a memorable retirement party in the local community. Someone had posted it with a picture. My face wasn't clear, but my silhouette on the stage was easy to see. The phone buzzed with messages from the family chat. I flipped it open, reading each line. Calvin had sent first, his words cold and sharp. "I'm so disappointed in you. How selfish would you be to do that in front of everyone?" I imagined his face. He always thought of himself as the guardian of tradition, never one to let anyone break the order. Greg's next message was gentler. "Are you okay? If you need to talk, I'm here." But that was it. I closed the phone, wondering whether I should be angry or amused by the differences between the two brothers. Carol called just as I was about to make coffee. Her voice was soft and hesitant. "I know you did what you believed was right, but it's hard for people to understand. Your father, your brothers, they're still in shock. I just want you to take care of yourself, not let yourself get hurt anymore." I heard the familiar struggle in her voice, motherly love on one side, and the responsibility to keep up the facade of peace for the family on the other. "Mom, I'm fine. I just want to be true to myself, no matter what the cost." On the other end of the line, Carol sighed. "I know, Lauren. I've known for a long time. I just haven't had the courage to say it." Midday, I met Janine at a street cafe near the park. The atmosphere inside was bustling, the sound of the coffee grinder mixed with the laughter of customers, the smell of cinnamon rolls mixed with the aroma of espresso. Oil paintings by local artists lined the walls, and sunlight poured through large glass windows onto the light wooden table where Janine and I sat across from each other. I told her everything, not hiding my insecurities, the fear of being isolated, of being labeled a troublemaker. Janine took a sip of her latte and said sternly, "You've lived too long for a false peace. Sometimes, true peace only comes after a big collision." Everyone thinks honesty is good, but they just want others to pay the price for them. I thought she was right, perhaps. This was the first time I had been completely honest, even though I knew I would have to endure the storm of that honesty. As I was scrolling through online comments, Miguel's email popped up, "Proud to work with you." Just a few words, but I felt the sincerity and respect that not everyone in my family was giving me at the moment. A part of me felt grateful that there were still people out there who recognized my worth outside of the family shadow. The climax came when I received an anonymous, nameless message that simply said, "Thank you. I see myself in your story." That message touched me more deeply than anything else. Perhaps my courage is not only for myself, but also for those out there, still waiting for someone to step out of the darkness like I did. As I left the cafe, I carried with me the aroma of cinnamon rolls and the bitter taste of afternoon coffee, feeling a little lighter. Looking at the strange art paintings hanging on the wall, I realized all the familiar doors have closed and no one will suddenly open them for me anymore. Perhaps it is time for me to build a new door for myself, the door of maturity, of freedom and honesty, even if the price is a moment of loneliness. I stepped outside, the Madison air crisp and the sun glinting on the sidewalk. I realized that life's smallest rituals, a cup of coffee, a hug from a friend, a text message of encouragement, were the first bricks to build my own new door. Some wounds never heal until you face the person who left them. That morning, I stood outside the old house for a long time, my breath in the cool early spring air. Franklin's suburban home hadn't changed much. The red brick walls, the gravel driveway, the maple trees in the front yard with new buds. I walked toward the door, my hands gripping the steering wheel, feeling nervous and hesitant like a child about to enter the living room to ask his father for permission for something important. Carol opened the door, her smile as gentle as ever, but her eyes seemed to remind me, no matter what happens, I'm here. She pulled me into the house, the smell of freshly baked oatmeal cookies filling the air. Old Benny lazily lifted his head from the rug by the fireplace, his tail wagging slightly, then snuggled into my legs as an old habit. Franklin was sitting in the living room, the soft light filtering through the half-closed curtains, painting the carpet with scattered yellow streaks. He held a framed photo in his arms, the one I had given him at the party, the two of us at the science fair. He paused when he saw me, then set the photo on the table, rubbing his hands against his knees as if to steady himself. There was silence, broken only by the ticking of the wall clock and Benny's slow breathing. I sat down in the chair across from him, unsure where to begin. Finally, Franklin broke the silence. This picture. I forgot it existed. He looked at me, his gray eyes rarely soft. I'm not good at this. I know you're mad at me. I never meant to hurt you, Lauren. It's just, I don't know how to raise someone who's different. I sighed, half heartbroken, half relieved. I spent my whole life looking for your approval until I realized I might never get it. But I stopped chasing, Dad. I live my life for myself, not for applause. I tried to keep my voice even, though my hand still tightened around the hot cup of tea Carol had handed me. Franklin shrugged, smiling wryly. I know I was stubborn and sometimes selfish. I always thought things would be easier if you followed my path. But looking back, I'm proud of you, Lauren. Even though I never said it right. The words were awkward, rough, but they were the most sincere I'd ever heard from him. I could feel it in the way he looked at me, no more scrutiny, no more disappointment, just simple, honest recognition. Carol brought a tray of homemade oatmeal cookies and tea and set it on the table, not intruding on the conversation, but the quiet squeeze of her hand under the table warmed my heart. We sat there, eating cookies and drinking tea, the old dog occasionally rubbing his head against my leg. No one spoke about it. It's been a long time, but I know the old family photos still stacked on the mantelpiece are an indelible part of my memory, as are the scars in my heart and in his. Before leaving, Franklin stood up, walked over and hugged me tightly, without a word wasted. Thank you for coming back, Lauren. This house is always open for you. Carol escorted me to the car. Her affectionate eyes seemed to convey 100 things that could not be put into words. As I drove home, I felt lighter than I had ever felt before. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It's being free enough to leave the door unlocked, to open myself up to both the pain and the hope. I know I can't change the past, but I can choose to move forward with the scars, with the lessons, and with the freedom I finally found for myself. Sometimes, healing isn't about fixing what's broken, but about starting over with yourself and with the people who have been quietly trying to love you all along the way. It took me years to realize that, in my yearning for a different family, I had repeatedly overlooked the people who were truly there for me, even in the small acts I took for granted when I was younger. Early that morning, the early summer sun bathed Carol's small backyard in golden sunshine. My mother and I set up a picnic table in the yard, the smell of fresh grass mixed with the scent of lavender and roses that Carol had meticulously tended. The table was simple but cozy, an old checkered tablecloth, large glasses for homemade lemonade, and the oven sizzling steadily as the golden corn was ripening. Carol and I didn't talk much, but her gentle hands and occasional laughter between our small stories melted away the years of distance. Janine showed up with dessert, a fragrant baked berry crumble, and her voice always brightened the mood. You won't be getting away with trying it first, she teased, her eyes shining with genuine joy. Aunt Shirley came later, hugging me for a long time before sitting down at the table, her eyes full of affection and wistful nostalgia. Don't be like me, Lauren. Don't let regret be an unfinished story. Follow your own path and remember that you're never really alone. Laughter, clinking glasses, the scent of roasting meat, butter, and herbs wafted through the air. Soon, Miguel stopped by, bearing a bouquet of wildflowers picked from the roadside and a simple greeting, "To the courage of everyday life, Lauren." The words warmed my heart. Each friend, each family member around the table that day felt like a piece of a puzzle I had never appreciated enough in the past. The group sat around the picnic table, the corn on the cob, the lemonade, the crumbles melting on the tip of the tongue. The string lights on the garden fence twinkled in the twilight. The fireflies flickered like tiny memories coming back. Carol asked me about my work for the first time, not with concern, but with genuine pride and excitement. I told her about my new project, about the things I was working on, about my plans to teach a class for girls who love science at the community center next fall. They listened without judgment, without comparison, just loving people waiting for me to tell my story. The climax came when Janine raised her glass, her eyes sparkling under the lights. We all have to learn to choose our families. And Lauren, you chose the right one. Everyone. Laughing together, clinking glasses, a new, small, but meaningful ritual that affirmed that I truly belonged here, among people I loved and trusted. That night, after everyone had left, I cleaned the yard with my mother. We didn't talk much, just stopped occasionally, watching the fireflies twinkling in the dark garden. A gentle feeling of satisfaction rose in my heart, like an instrumental song of peace that I had been searching for all this time. Back home, I lay down on my bed, my hair smelling of lemon juice and charcoal smoke. That night, I fell asleep with a smile on my face, no longer a child yearning for approval, but a woman who had built a little world for herself to be loved. For the first time in years, I felt truly ready to step into the future I was shaping. There's a special power in telling your own story before anyone else has a chance to write it for you. That night, the lights in my small apartment stayed on longer than usual. Outside, the steady hum of Madison's cars drifted down the street, occasionally mingling with the scent of freshly cut grass and baked bread from a nearby bakery. I sat alone at the kitchen table, a cup of hot herbal tea in front of me and a scattering of notes, scribbled hastily between the crossed-out, rewritten passages. The local STEM summit was just days away, and I still hadn't found the perfect tone for my speech. Memories were swirling around in my head, Franklin's stern words, my mother's silent encouragement, the times I'd won a science fair without my family there, the nights I'd fallen asleep at my desk, hoping that someday someone would be proud of me. I opened the video call with Janine, the light from the screen reflecting on my best friend's face, the same mischievous smile. You've come this far, Lauren. Don't let anyone take away your right to tell your story. The more honest you are, the more others will know they're not alone. Janine reminded me of something she once said, your pain can be someone else's permission to heal. I wrote it down on paper, my heart stilling for a moment, feeling the weight and freedom it brought. Miguel called while I was in the midst of my thoughts. He told me about his first day in the lab, when he was the only one on the team who spoke English with a southern accent, feeling out of place and being whispered behind his back. It's only when you start embracing your differences and turning them into strengths that you truly have a voice. Lauren, don't be afraid to be vulnerable. That's what makes people believe in you. I went back to the kitchen table and rewrote the opening paragraph a dozen times. My narrative, confident yet vulnerable. I wrote about my forgotten childhood, about running away from expectations, about the retirement party and the photo that changed everything. I wrote about pain, about hope, and about the wonder of finding a new family through old wounds. With each line, I asked myself, do I dare let everyone know the truth? And each time I did, I thought of Janine, of Miguel, of the people who had texted me after the party, telling me that they had been Lauren somewhere in their lives. Before I went to sleep, I posted an introduction on social media. I'm going to tell my story soon, not to accuse anyone, but to remind myself and others like me, you don't need permission to speak your truth. Almost immediately, words of encouragement flooded in. Thank you. Can't wait to hear. You inspire me. On the day of the conference, I stepped onto the stage with my heart pounding in my chest. Under the yellow lights, I began to tell the story of a little girl who wished she could see, of a father who didn't know how to love, of growing up in silence, and finally choosing to be honest, even in the face of loneliness. I looked down and saw the attentive eyes of high school girls, of former colleagues, of people I had never met. With each little story I told, they were silent, sometimes nodding, sometimes laughing or shedding tears. The climax came when I stopped after the last line. We are not defined by the silence of others. We are defined by the courage to tell our stories and the belief that someone will listen. When I left the stage, the entire audience stood up and applauded, not just for the speech, but for all those who have never been heard. That night, when I got home, I sat at the kitchen table, a cup of herbal tea still warm in my hand, the city lights shining through the windows. The handwritten notes were still scattered on the table, but I felt strangely at peace. I wondered, who is listening out there? And would their actually listening make a difference? I didn't know for sure, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the uncertainty. Sometimes it's easier to stand in front of a room full of strangers than to be true to yourself. The morning of the STEM Summit began with a frenetic pace, the sound of automatic glass doors opening, the click of high heels on marble floors, the buzz of conversation among groups of people from all over. I wore my Lauren Sheffield advocate badge, both surprised and proud. The conference tote bag was tucked under my arm, holding the last of my notes, the purple pen Janine had given me my freshman year. I walked into the waiting room behind the stage. The cold air from the air conditioning made my palms clammy, but the energy from my colleagues and the strange faces around me made me feel less alone than ever. Janine sat in the front row, catching my eye and flashing me a reassuring smile, while Miguel waited in the aisle with his signature encouraging gaze. The lights came on and the MC called my name. I stepped out, my heartbeat matching the applause. The room was silent, except for the echo of the microphone and the expectant eyes of hundreds of people, mostly young women, but also older men, faces I had never known. Strangely, even though they were strangers, I no longer felt out of place. I began my speech, no longer holding back or avoiding. I used to think my worth was only as good as my family's approval. But it turns out that sometimes the only thing holding you back is the fear that you'll never be good enough. I told of my quiet childhood in Madison, of the retirement party where I decided to tell my story, of the restless nights in lab, and about the moment I chose to be honest instead of continuing to play the good girl role. The audience listened quietly. A few nodded. I noticed tears glistening on the cheeks of a student sitting in the aisle. When I told him about sending the photo to my father and the unexpected freedom of no longer needing his permission, an unexpected round of applause erupted mid-speech. I told him about Janine, about Miguel, about my mother, Carol, people who had helped me understand that family is where you truly come to be, and that each of us has the right to choose where we come from. In closing, I said, difference is not a weakness. It is a strength that we have never been taught to appreciate. Under the light, I looked down and saw Janine with red eyes, Miguel smiling proudly, and hundreds of people, each with their own story, but now joined together in something bigger. As I left the stage, a group of women approached me. They told me similar stories about parents who didn't love their children the way they needed, about feeling invisible at work or in their own homes. A young student shyly took my hand. "Sister, now I know I can try, without having to ask permission from anyone." I squeezed her hand, my heart feeling like it was patched together. During my coffee break, I noticed that my badge had attracted attention, supporter. A small cluster of people gathered around me, asking about my experiences, my failures, and how I started over. I smiled more, drank my weak coffee from a conference logo paper cup, and realized that I was no longer an outsider. I was helping to create a safe space where people could be honest about their journeys. The climax came sooner than I expected. My speech was recorded and spread across social media. Snippets were shared. Hashtags about the power of honesty, career breakthrough, STEM for all popped up on people's feeds. Overnight, I received interview requests, letters of encouragement from former colleagues, and speaking events in faraway states. My story and their stories began to create a small ripple effect, spreading hope to those who were still struggling quietly. Backstage, when the applause finally died down, I stood still for a long time, my hands still shaking slightly. For the first time, I realized that I had become the person I had longed to be as a child. Not because I was perfect, but because I had dared to be honest, to strangers and to myself. Peace, I used to think, came only after every crack in the past had been perfectly mended. But one sunny Saturday, in my mother's familiar little living room, I began to understand. True peace comes from accepting those cracks, from learning to live with them and see them as a part of you, imperfect, but real and lasting. The weekend sun poured down on the coffee table where my mother, Carol, and I sat together. We opened old photo albums, flipping through old pictures. Me and my two brothers in our blue-striped pajamas, Franklin smiling beside our homemade tent in the backyard, my mother sitting by the tiny Christmas tree with sparkling eyes. We smiled, no longer troubled by the past. Each photo was a piece of memory, sometimes sweet, sometimes a little wistful, but for the first time, I felt like I could smile without feeling a pang in my heart. The radio played an old jazz tune, a tune that had accompanied me from late nights studying alone to bright mornings in this kitchen. Mom looked at me, her eyes softer than ever. "You've come further than I ever dreamed," she whispered, her hand resting lightly on the photo album, as if afraid the memories would vanish if she held on too tightly. The phone rang. Aunt Shirley was calling, her voice booming through the speaker, energetic and affectionate. "Lauren, you've done something that generations before you never thought possible. I'm proud of you and hope you'll always remember that no one can take your story away from you." We laughed, exchanged well wishes, and listened to the distant whistle of a train outside, a reminder of long ago journeys. A moment later, the door opened. Franklin walked in, looking awkward with a box of apple pie in his hand. He placed it on the table, avoiding my eyes at first. There were no hugs, no profuse apologies. Just Franklin, with his usual awkwardness, looking at me and saying, "I heard your speech was good." The words were simple, unadorned, neither denying nor condescending, as if he had practiced them many times in front of a mirror. I returned the smile, thanking him for the pie. The three of us sat down together, sharing bites of the warm apple pie, fragrant with cinnamon and ripe apples. We talked about the weather, the trees in the backyard, the little things of everyday life. No big things from the past, no painful memories. But I felt something shift, subtle but palpable, a mutual recognition, though no words had quite come out yet. The climax of the afternoon came quietly. I felt no bitterness, no resentment, no blame. Instead, there was only gratitude to my mother for her quiet love, to Franklin for being there, and to the old days that had given me the patience and courage to continue writing my own story. Before leaving, I stood in front of my childhood home, looking back at the tree-lined front yard, the birdsong echoing overhead. Franklin shook my hand, firm but unhurried. Carol held me for a long time. No one said anything, but everything that needed to be said seemed to be contained in that silence. I left that house feeling lighter than ever. Not taking all the memories with me, keeping only what I wanted to keep, enough to remind me of what had passed, and enough to move forward without being held back by what couldn't be changed. In the car, I opened the windows, letting the scent of apples, cinnamon, and early summer sunshine in. I know I still have a lot to learn about forgiveness, but today I took a long step on that journey, and finally, I felt at peace. You don't need to be seen by the world to live a meaningful life. The only thing you need, really, is to learn to see yourself clearly. Those words I often share with the young women I mentor, and I sometimes remind myself on spring mornings when the sunlight streams through the windows of my small apartment, shining brightly on the fresh flower pots I carefully tend every weekend. My new life no longer revolves around the expectations of others. Every day now begins with a gentle rhythm. I open the window, let in the fresh air and birdsong, then make myself a cup of strong coffee, take a deep breath, and enjoy my own sense of peace. I used to take those moments for granted, thinking that only when I reach great achievements can I truly live. Now I understand. The meaning lies not in the applause outside, but in the peaceful sound of my heart inside. That morning, I went to the community center, a small, pale blue building down the street, with fragrant lilacs outside the windows. Inside, the classroom was lined with desks and chairs, and the whiteboard read, "Welcome to Science, where every question counts." I adjusted the projector, checked the lab kits, and looked around the room full of eager faces, all teenage girls, their eyes bright with curiosity and anticipation. I began the workshop with a simple question: who here has ever felt like they didn't belong? A few hands raised hesitantly, their eyes looking at me expectantly. I told them about my days sitting alone in the cafeteria, about the fear of entering a lab full of men, about my first courageous moment of speaking up, and about the immense joy of realizing that my worth did not lie in the approval of others. They laughed when I joked about failed experiments that left the room smelling of rotten eggs. They eagerly participated in group projects, debated, and cheered each other on when a new idea was presented. In the middle of the room, I was no longer a lone storyteller, but a link in a chain of inspirational action from those who came before me to those who came after me. At the end of class, I received a series of hasty hugs, scribbled thank you notes, and a small envelope from the brunette girl sitting in the front row. "Thanks to you, I think I can try too." I kept the letter in my pocket, a little treasure to remind me of the true meaning of all the effort. Leaving the community center, I met Janine outside our usual coffee shop. We sat by the glass door, sipping cappuccinos, laughing about little things. She had just been promoted to head of engineering, and I shared the positive feedback from my class that morning. Janine looked at me proudly and said, "Lauren, you've not only changed your life, but you've paved the way for others." That statement warmed my heart, not because of pride, but because I could see that I had truly become the person I had always wanted to be. A message popped up on my phone. Miguel had sent me a photo of a bulletin board at my new company, an article about the impact of women in STEM, with a quote from my summit speech. "Keep spreading the word, Lauren," he wrote. I responded with a smiley face, filled with simple joy. That afternoon, Carol called. I stood by the window, watching the red tulips sway in the wind, listening to my mother's voice, deeper and more mature than it had been before. "You know," she said, "I'm proud of you, not just because you've become successful, but because you've remained gentle and kind." The words, so simple, were like warm water soothing the last scratches in my soul. The highlight of the day was not a big victory, but a handwritten letter I received from a girl in my class. I don't know if I can be as successful as you, but I will try. Thank you for believing that everyone deserves a chance. I placed the letter next to my old notes, feeling like I had just planted another green seed in someone's life. In the evening, I strolled through the park near my house, where wildflowers bloomed brightly along the paths and children laughed under the yellow lights. Sometimes I stopped to watch the sparrows flap their wings, listen to the cheerful laughter, and felt my heart filled with joy, not because I had been recognized, but because I had dared to be true to myself. As I walked across the lawn, the late afternoon sun warming my face, I knew my story wasn't over. It was simply mine, and I was living it every day. Sometimes legacy isn't about what we leave behind, but the small fires we leave behind, letting others know they, too, deserve to shine in their own way. I returned to my apartment, arranged the flower pots on the windowsill, looked around the bright and welcoming room, where everything reflected a part of me now. The laughter of my students echoed in my memory. The joyful exhaustion after a long day was no longer a burden, but a testament to a life reclaimed. And so I live, peacefully, proudly, without needing noisy recognition, just knowing my own worth. I smile, closing another day, my heart filled with hope for all those on the journey to find their own voice. I am Lauren, a person who has gone through a long journey to find her own worth, and also a person like many of you here, once longing for recognition, once thinking that only by pleasing others can I be worthy of love. Looking back on the story of the past 16 chapters, I realized that the biggest thing I learned was not how to become perfect in someone else's eyes, but knowing how to listen and appreciate myself, even in my most lost moments. Perhaps what moved me most was understanding that sometimes the love I longed for most did not come from my own blood relatives, but from the small, sincere connections around me. Forgiveness is not just for others, it is a gift I give to myself to feel lighter, to grow, to move forward freely. After all, the meaning of life is not for the whole world to see, but for myself to feel at peace in every decision, every choice every day. I wonder, have you ever felt like an outsider in your own home? Have you ever had to choose between the courage to speak up and a false sense of security? If so, please share your feelings and stories in the comments, because who knows, someone might read it and find the same empathy I did. If this journey resonates with you, leave a comment number 1, or let me know where you're watching from. Your input is invaluable to me. And if you love my heartwarming, relatable stories about family and resilience, don't forget to subscribe to my channel to continue my journey. Thank you for staying until the end, for listening, for empathizing, and for allowing me to share my truth. May you always have the strength to write your own story with all the pride and tenderness you deserve. See you in the next stories.